Welcome to Intersections, where faith, ideas, and life meet. Today we'll be talking about sermons, and our title for the session today is Great Expectations. I remember once when I was traveling in Atlanta, I was passing a place that had this big arbor and sawdust on the ground and people all seated there, and I thought, what in the world is happening here? So I got out and realized as I stood there in my jeans that it was an old-fashioned Methodist camp meeting, and I decided to participate. So I sat on about the third bench, rough-hewn wood, and waited for the preacher to come out, only to find out that the preacher was Fred Craddock. Now, Fred Craddock, I had actually read a book of his when learning how to preach, and the book was actually given to me by one of my friends, Randy Roberts, and so I had appreciated Fred Craddock from many, many years previous to that, but I had never met him. When he walked out into the sawdust and took his place behind the pulpit in front of not too many people, I wondered how he could measure up to the man I had met in the book. And then he began to preach. And of all the sermons I've heard in my life, one line stands out that Fred Craddock spoke in that sermon. He spoke a sermon about the people we invite to our table, and how he raised the question of how could you know what people are like? And this is how he answered. He said, you can tell who they are by who sits at their table. You can tell who they are by who sits at their table. It was a wonderful sermon. I'll remember the sawdust, I'll remember the arbor, but I'll always remember that statement. You can tell who they are by who sits at their table. And it raises the question of how is it that we remember sermons, and what sermons are they that we forget, and why do we forget them?
If you can tell who they are by who sits at their table, I must be a great person since I'm surrounded by great people like you.
But are you going to serve us a meal? That's the question.
So far we're agreeing with
Where's the food? Where's the food?
Well, great expectations, whether it's the best of sermons or the worst of sermons, we all have sermons that we remember. Yes. So anything that comes to your mind as perhaps the most memorable, whether it's the best or the worst or anything in between?
One sermon that I remember was by George Buttrick, who was the preacher to Harvard University. He had been down in Manhattan and had been the pastor of the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, and during that time had been the editor of the Interpreter's Bible. And at Harvard, it was the twilight of his career, that church, the university church, was packed. There were people literally sitting in the aisles to hear this man. He had a voice that was a little bit like, you know, something scratching glass. It was not a mellifluous voice. But what he would do is that he would lay out images. They had some connection with Scripture, but some connection with the contemporary world. I remember one time he talked about seeing big cranes, construction cranes, and he saw them as in the form of a cross. You know? So he played with that theme for a while. And then, like a musician, he would bring in a second theme. And he would develop that. And then he'd go back to the first one. And he'd weave these together. And it was biblical. It was applied to the present scene. And it was done in a way that you'd never forget.
Wow.
I'll never forget your story of it.
Thank you. I liked your story.
It's interesting looking at sermons. I've heard that over a lifetime, people remember, what, about 3 or 4 sermons? What, lifetime?
That's it? Wow.
But they've heard. Well, I added it up. If we start going to church at 5 years old, by the time we're 25, I mean, because we remember beginning around 5, by the time we're 25 years old, we would have heard 1,000 sermons. So it's about 1,000 every 20 years. So think by the time you're 60, you will have heard 3,000 sermons. But like you say, Lee, we only remember 2 or 3.
Why is that?
This isn't terribly encouraging.
No, it isn't.
Randy, perhaps you preach more than any one of us here. Is there a sermon that you remember, besides yours? Not that I don't think you would mention yours to begin with, but is there one that has been memorable one for you?
Yes, in fact, there are quite a few of them, but you would probably expect that from somebody who preaches to notice and remember. As Carla was talking about Fred Craddock, I can think of several of his sermons that not only are extremely memorable, but had a real impact on my life. When the Roll is Called Down Here was one of those. A sermon just titled by the question, Who Cares? Both were exceptional sermons. When he preached here at University Church about 2 years ago, it was an exceptional sermon that I can remember with just one word. The word was next.
Oh, yeah.
And anyone who heard that sermon, hearing that word, would remember the essence of the sermon. There have been others as well. William Willimon is a personal favorite that I have been challenged and blessed by, as well as some others who are fairly well known these days. Bill Hybels years ago preached a sermon called The Often Overlooked Benefits of Losing. That was an exceptional sermon for me, so there are quite a few.
What helps you? What is it that you remember about a sermon? Because you're saying the titles. Do you remember the content, the stories? What's memorable? Would you say?
Several things. One is kind of, Roy, what you referred to a little bit ago is kind of the artistic piece is really of interest to me, and I notice that. That sometimes is what stands out as memorable. But maybe as much as anything else, it's just whether or not that sermon is biblical and then connected to my life and world. If somehow those two worlds, like John Stott said, if those two worlds come together, to me it's memorable.
You say if it's biblical. Is it possible to have a sermon that isn't biblical? And what does that look like?
Unfortunately.
Well,
I can tell you what it feels like. It feels like you want to walk out and just keep on walking. I think when somebody has not spent enough time in the text to really hear what the text is saying, what the text said to the original listeners, readers, hearers, I think it's possible to preach a sermon that has all kinds of biblical passages but is not in and of itself biblical.
oh, so you're not calling a sermon biblical, just that uses text.
Not at all.
If you think about Jesus' sermons or stories, they're not always referring to a passage in his Bible, which was the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. You hear stories, but you hear really biblical truths nonetheless, not just because he said it, but because of the theme that is contained within.
Well, what makes a sermon memorable, though? I mean, Carly, you mentioned an incredible number of sermons that people are going to remember over a lifetime, something like 3,000, not remember, but hear, probably something like 3,000 sermons. And if you only remember 3 or 4 of them, what is it?
For me, it's
that
stories.
jumps out? It's stories.
Stories that are told, and it always helps if the story actually connects with the point that the preacher was trying to make.
But it doesn't always, does it?
Doesn't always.
Doesn't always, yeah.
And I've preached a few times, and sometimes I like the story so much that I forced it into the sermon.
So you have a good illustration
sure
You
looking for
find
a
a
sermon.
text to back it up?
Text to back it up.
If
and-
possible.
Yeah, if possible. He mangled. No. Yeah, there's a temptation, and sometimes one yields to it. I have.
How do you begin a sermon? I mean, does the sermon start with a story? Does it start with an image? Does it start with a text? Or does it start many different places, but you end up getting these different elements together into a story? Ta-da!
Well, I think sermon preparation and preaching really are about 2 core questions. One is, what will I say? And second, how will I say it? The what will I say piece, I think, comes predominantly from Scripture, from the text, is going to the text and trying to hear what the text is saying. That gives you the material, if you will, the information, so to speak, of what is going to be said. And then comes the question, now that I have this sense of what I'm going to say, comes the question, how am I going to say it? Which can also be clearly informed by the text of Scripture. But also, I think there is, I don't know if the right word is license, but at least there is the ability to say, how will this be most clearly heard in the contemporary world? And I think when you make that decision, then it leads you to where you begin, the sermon itself.
I remember hearing Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament scholar, giving a lecture actually at the Society of Biblical Literature. It wasn't a sermon, but it was. And the phrase from the Old Testament that he went back to is, there's a voice in Ramah, Rachel weeping for her children. And then he would go through times in the New Testament where people were gathered in mourning, and then come down to the Holocaust and to our day. And he kept repeating that phrase and developing it and expanding it. And it was all biblical, and it had a focus. But it didn't seem jammed into the contemporary world at all. I'll never forget that phrase.
Kind of timeless.
Yeah.
Well, we might say that we remember 2 or 3 sermons, but that's conscious memory. I remember when I was in Atlanta, happened upon a corner where a lot of homeless people had gathered, and a preacher, they were feeding these people at noon, but beforehand a preacher was coming and preaching to the homeless. And the process of standing with the homeless and hearing a story about John the Baptist, I don't remember anything more than that. The preacher didn't say any profound thing, but the context was profound, and I remember that the sermon was very biblical in that this person was really trying to hear Scripture, and that context, well, I can't consciously remember the sermon, it changed me, you know, because I was one of the homeless all of a sudden. There was no difference between me and them in their eyes, and that was a profound experience.
I read of supposedly, I don't know where or when, but just read about a question that was asked in an editorial piece in some Christian journal about the value of sermons. And they quoted actually what you all have been quoting statistically, that a Christian in his or her life will probably hear 3,000 or 3,200 sermons. And the person writing the question to the editor said, it strikes me that on reflection, I can only remember 3 or 4 of these. Would it not be better for preachers to spend their time doing something else that would be of greater and more lasting value? And apparently there was quite a storm of response of people agreeing and disagreeing, until someone wrote in and said, I have eaten however many thousand meals in my life.
Right.
Exactly.
It strikes me that I can remember very few of them as far as their exact menu, but that without them, I would no longer be alive. So that gave me some encouragement to say it is nourishment along the way. Even if you don't recall the precise menu, it is hopefully a part of what keeps the Church of Jesus living and vibrant and going back out into the world.
I think I'll remember this story for a long time. It's very encouraging.
I think relevance is really important in terms of relevance to where the person in the pew is. This, just very recently at the Calamasa Church, a young gentleman, junior pastor by the name of Dustin Cohn, produced a video on how the community views the local church. They have an outreach where they're going to try and reach within 3 blocks, get to know people there. And they interviewed various people in the community. That really jumped out at me, because I'm thinking, how are we perceived? How do we talk to people when they see all these cars pulling up in the neighborhood? It was interesting that they also interviewed some bikers who have a garage over the other side of the street there, and these bikers were saying, we might come over sometime. And we look intimidating, but we're not. But the way that we are perceived is important, and so often then maybe a sermon has a lot to do with where we're at.
I haven't preached very many sermons, but when I have, it's certain images that strike me. There was a book about Babi Yar by Yevtushenko, and it was the story of killing Poles in a chasm. And these were the Russians that had come in and were killing Poles. And it struck me that that becomes a kind of metaphor for suffering, for evil. And then you have, from the biblical, you have to go to the right level in the biblical thing. For me, it was the way. And so I could go to the whole of the Old Testament and the people of God continuing to go through opposition and torture and everything else, and for the Christians today as well. So it was the chasm and the way. And that's just one way to approach it. And it wasn't a particular passage of Scripture. It was a big enough metaphor so that different things from Scripture could fit in.
Another angle that I like to throw in is the relationship between the preacher and the listener. As a listener, it always helps me if I like the preacher. Not only to have it be memorable, but also, more importantly, have it be meaningful to me in a way that would encourage me or motivate me to live accordingly. And as clearly, I mean, here's example of children, your own children or your nephew or whatever. If they're doing something, it may mean nothing in terms of substance, but you have such
you
empathy,
like that.
and so it has meaning for you. And in a similar way, I think with the preacher, especially if it's your regular preacher, your
Yeah.
regular pastor, having a favorable disposition, outlook, relationship always helps, I think. And
It's the hometown discount, is that what you're saying?
No, but don't you
That's
think
true.
we decide very quickly, even if we don't know someone,
Yeah.
whether we like them or we don't? So it's not just, you're not just talking about long-term relationships, you're talking about how people come
that
across.
too, yeah, and
Yeah.
that impression makes it powerful. And so, and I'd even go so far as to say that liking your pastor, or at least trying to like your pastor, may actually have a very strong spiritual impact upon your life,
Interesting.
because that's what the person that you will be listening to, for a long time.
I know that when I go to conferences and I look down the list of seminars and breakout sessions and speakers and so forth, I'm interested in what the topics and the themes are that are going to be spoken on. That's not the first thing I look at. First thing I look at is who the presenter is. And that's where my first choice is made about which breakout sessions I'm going to attend. And Julius, maybe part of it is simply that. Do I connect with this person? Is this woman, is this man authentic and real? Are they relevant? Are they biblical?
Of
There's a
all
lot
of us
validity
here,
to that.
you preach every Sabbath, and they're superb sermons as far as I'm concerned. I'm curious, what's the rhythm of sermon preparation in a week? Are you panic-stricken if you don't know the treatment of the
Yes.
next Sabbath sermon by Monday evening, or how does it work generally?
Well, for me, a lot of just survival has to do with prior planning, laying out the full year, first of all, knowing where we as a church are going sermonically throughout that year, breaking it down into series and weeks and what's happening when. That's a big part of it to begin with. And then throughout the year, anytime I run across something that I know could fit, for example, right now we're going through James, would fit with James, I can put it in that file. And so there's a certain sense of preparation that's going on many months before. Then as each week happens, when Sunday evening or Monday morning comes and I open that file, I just pray, let there be something there. And those are really good weeks when there's quite a bit already there. When it opens up to a blank document, then there's a great cry heard in Ramah.
But there's a lot of pastors who will say, not a lot, but some who will say, it's Friday night, I better go prepare my sermon.
Oh, no.
Talk to that.
I would have been finished off. I couldn't live with that kind of stress. It's just, that would be
Yeah.
too stressful. For me, ideally, and unfortunately, in the midst of ideal, the real happens and life happens. And so I can't speak to all those exceptions, but I would say ideally, Monday I get 3 or 4 hours with the sermon, and typically speaking, that's just with the text, just trying to develop in my own interaction with the text and the Spirit what I understand it to be saying. If there's any time on Tuesday, because Tuesday is our staff meeting and other meeting days, so it can be a little iffy. I do commentary work either then or some on Wednesday morning as well. And hopefully by the end of that, have a pretty clear idea where it's going. And then by Thursday, I'm working on the manuscript and the outline, all along trying to draw illustrations, and then Friday is a long day.
I remember,
Thank
Randy,
you.
from years ago, 20-some years ago, I remember a very irritating statement that you made to me once.
Just one.
Yeah, well,
Irritating for him or for you?
actually, it turned out to be irritating for us both, but it began coming this way, where I was developing a sermon, and I went to Randy to ask for some feedback. We were both in our 20s, or was it teens? And I told him, and he said, I just have one question. Do you remember?
Unfortunately.
Yeah. He said, just give me the sermon in one sentence. I said, but no, it takes a little bit longer than a sentence. He said, no, I want to hear it in one sentence. That was very irritating. But I found that if you can't say in a sentence, you can't give it in longer. Of course, I then, I think, gave that back to you at some point. But very difficult.
It's very hard.
Very difficult.
That grew out of probably a number of places, but not the least of which was the story about the guest speaker at a church whose earlier part of the service ran long, and the pastor kept leaning over and saying, hey, we're running a little short, can you cut it down? And he was getting it shorter and shorter until finally he was down to about 10 minutes. He said, can you do it? And the preacher said, look, I don't know it that well. I can't do it in that amount of time. And so that is so true. It is a matter of being able to say, here is what I'm saying.
But that's one of the reasons you get the first sentence or two and the last sentence or two. And if you could hang on to the last sentence or two, then you know at least where you're going to land, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, we live in a culture now where if you watch TV, there's commercials every so often. And it just seems that the brain is just geared now to short attention spans. And sometimes you come in halfway through. Now, I've got a question. Any of you ever get bored during a sermon?
Yes.
No.
Anyone will admit that they're bored?
What's really
Yes,
bad is when you're
absolutely.
bored and you're preaching. That's what's really bad.
Yeah,
what
and
do you do
related with that, I want to ask, if I may piggyback. We're talking about great expectations, but are we expecting too much? And in terms of the length of time, or in terms of the weight that we put in, and so there maybe our great expectation is so high that we're bored, perhaps.
Well, some people, Bill Lovelace has sometimes said this, the day of the sermon is over. We're going to talk, conversationally and so on. And it seems to me that Bill is wrong. Sorry. And it's a little
getting
bit,
a call.
it's a little bit like saying radio is over because television has arrived. Well, radio isn't over. And I think that people who say the sermon is over are people who are implying somehow that worship services, the traditional worship service, is sort of passé. And I think that sermons still, when they are done well, they are terribly moving. They are things you think about the whole week. And I think it's great if people go from a worship service to a meal and they talk about the sermon negatively or positively.
Doesn't
That's
matter.
a great
That's right.
step right there.
Great
Don't you think, though, that there's been a movement toward maybe the emphasis is a little too strong, but the place of the sermon in the context of the overall program has been diminished because of the other great things that are happening. And so in that sense, the place of the sermon or the weight the sermon has in a worship, whether you like it or not, Roy,
You should see him looking at you.
has been diminished, or is my perception skewed?
Yes.
I shouldn't have
I
asked
don't
that
know if that's entirely bad. Let me explain clearly what I mean. In some context, people depend on the sermon to carry all of the weight, and the rest of worship is viewed as preliminaries. I hear people referring to it in that way. Once the preliminaries are over, we get, and I always think, no. This is all worship.
Right.
It is all a part of what we do when we come to God, has biblical and theological foundations. So, in the sense that great worship makes for great preaching, then I would say it's not a bad thing if the sermon and the worship as a whole find a balance, but hopefully not by de-emphasizing the value of the sermon, but by emphasizing the importance of worship. We had this past Sabbath a marvelous worship service at University Church, and as I think back and I think about the music, about the reading of Scripture, about the participation of the congregation, about the entire act, everything was moving there. It was, I felt personally, drawn into the entire experience, not just because of the sermon and not just because I was participating in that way, but it was all kind of one piece. And hopefully the sermon was just a part of that, an important part, but a part nevertheless.
I think that's what I was trying to say.
Well, you carefully wove the sermon into the whole worship experience by talking about the early Sunday arrival of the women and the disciples and the various ways they might say, Christ is risen, and how it was increased in volume. And then he invited the congregation to say that, and as soon as that was over, in came the choir. So it was tied in. I think that if the sermon is integrated with the whole service, then each strengthens the other,
Yes.
Very
and people
powerful.
are taken further and further and further, as I
Yes.
said before, into the presence of God. And I think the other thing is, if the sermon is not simply didactic, that is to say, it's just teaching, but it is an invitation to a religious experience that is more than just Sabbath school,
Right.
you know.
Right.
But that takes a certain kind
lot
of
of
lyricism in the sermon.
Let me just say one quick thing, Lee, to what you were asking about boring. I think that boring grows directly out of feeling that whatever's happening is not connected to my life. And if I walked into a cardiac surgeon's convention, it would be very boring to me. And yet what they're talking about could conceivably save my life.
Sure, yeah.
But it's not connected to me and to my life and my world. The more closely it's connected, in other words, the less the distance between what's happening in the sermon and my life, the higher the impact. And so I think part of preaching is to say, where do our lives intersect? Where does it intersect with the text? Because if it relates to my life, there will be interest, even if it's not delivered in the most dynamic or poetic way.
That's right. That's right.
So it sounds like there needs to be a little bit of preparation on the part of those who are listening to sermons
Yeah.
as well.
You know, there's one thing that it seems to me, maybe it's particularly in America and maybe it's in certain religious traditions, but when sermons are just talking about how we ought to act and not how we come to God's presence.
So it's all about coming to God,
Yeah,
about
for
worship.
me.
We're out of time. You've been watching Intersections, where faith, ideas, and life meet.